The fluorescent lights of Westfield Community College's cafeteria buzzed overhead as Marcus Hendricks balanced his tray of day-old pizza and watered-down coffee. His worn sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor, the sound barely audible over the chatter of students who seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The frayed edges of his thrift store jeans caught on the plastic chair as he sat down at an empty table in the corner, away from the clusters of designer-clad students who dominated the center of the room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had learned early in his first semester to avoid eye contact during lunch. It wasn't that he was particularly shy, but the looks he received, a mixture of pity and disdain, had become exhausting. His second-hand backpack, patched with duct tape where the zipper had given way, sat beside him like a testament to his circumstances. Inside were textbooks he'd bought used online, their pages already highlighted by previous owners, margins filled with someone else's notes. At 22, Marcus was older than most of his classmates. While they had transitioned seamlessly from high school to college, he had spent 4 years working double shifts at a warehouse to save enough money for tuition. His hands, calloused from years of manual labor, looked out of place holding a pen during lectures. The other students' hands were soft, manicured, accustomed to typing on expensive laptops rather than loading trucks in freezing warehouses. The economics major had chosen this particular community college not for its reputation, which was modest at best, but because it was what he could afford. His scholarship covered tuition, but everything else came out of his own pocket. The studio apartment he rented was in a neighborhood where sirens were as common as alarm clocks, and his daily commute involved 2 bus transfers through parts of the city most of his classmates had never seen. Today felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air, whispers traveling from table to table about something happening after lunch. Marcus caught fragments of conversations as students passed his table. "Did you hear about the presentation this afternoon?" "Some military recruitment thing, I think. My dad says those people prey on the desperate." Marcus finished his pizza and headed toward his next class, Advanced Microeconomics, with Professor Elizabeth Hartwell. Dr. Hartwell was known for her sharp intellect and sharper tongue, a woman who had earned her Ph.D. from Harvard and never let anyone forget it. She wore her academic credentials like armor, and her classroom was her kingdom. The lecture hall was already filling when Marcus arrived. He took his usual seat in the back, pulling out his notebook. Actual paper, not a tablet like everyone else seemed to have. The scratching of his pen against the page was sometimes the only sound besides Dr. Hartwell's voice during particularly challenging lectures. "Before we begin today's discussion on market failures," Dr. Hartwell announced, adjusting her designer glasses, "I want to address the military recruitment presentation scheduled for this afternoon. I trust you'll all approach it with the critical thinking skills we've been developing in this course." A student in the front row, Cameron Richardson, raised his hand. Cameron was everything Marcus wasn't. Blonde, confident, wearing clothes that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. His father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and Cameron never missed an opportunity to mention it. "Professor, don't you think it's inappropriate to have military recruiters on a college campus? They're obviously targeting students who can't afford better options." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the classroom. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent. He had learned that speaking up in these situations only drew unwanted attention. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. "An astute observation, Cameron. The military-industrial complex has long relied on economic desperation as a recruitment tool. Students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are disproportionately represented in military ranks." "Exactly," chimed in Madison Wheeler, whose mother was a prominent local attorney. "It's basically exploitation. They promise college money to people who have no other choice." The conversation continued, with students sharing their opinions about military service, economic inequality, and the ethics of recruitment. Marcus noticed how they spoke about those people, the poor, the desperate, the ones with no other choice, as if they were discussing a different species entirely. None of them seemed to consider that one of those people might be sitting among them. After class, Marcus walked across campus toward the gymnasium where the military presentation was being held. He wasn't particularly interested in joining the armed forces, but he was curious about the opportunity it might represent. Unlike his classmates, he didn't have the luxury of dismissing options based on political ideology. The gymnasium was sparsely populated, maybe 30 students scattered across bleachers designed to hold hundreds. Marcus recognized most of the faces. They were the scholarship kids, the part-time workers, the ones who counted every dollar. Conspicuously absent were the Cameron Richardsons and Madison Wheelers of the campus. A crisp voice echoed through the gymnasium sound system. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to learn about opportunities in the United States Armed Forces." The speaker was a woman in her mid-30s, wearing dress blues that seemed to command respect even from a distance. Her posture was perfect, her voice clear and authoritative. Staff Sergeant Patricia Moreau had the kind of presence that filled a room, even one as large as the gymnasium. "I know many of you are here because you're exploring options for your future," she continued. "Some of you might be considering military service as a path to education, career training, or simply a way to serve your country. Others might be here out of curiosity. All of those reasons are valid." Marcus found himself paying closer attention than he had expected. Staff Sergeant Moreau spoke about opportunities in intelligence, logistics, communications, and dozens of other fields that had civilian applications. She talked about leadership training, global experience, and the kind of practical education that couldn't be found in textbooks. "Military service isn't for everyone," she acknowledged. "It requires dedication, discipline, and a willingness to put the needs of your unit and your country before your own comfort. But for those who are ready for that challenge, it can provide opportunities that might not be available elsewhere." During the question and answer session, Marcus listened as his fellow students asked about deployment schedules, education benefits, and career prospects. Their questions were practical, focused on concrete benefits rather than abstract ideals. These weren't students who could afford to make decisions based purely on principle. As the presentation concluded, Staff Sergeant Moreau announced that she would be available for individual consultations in the adjacent conference room. Marcus debated whether to approach her. He wasn't ready to make any commitments, but he was curious about what she might have to say. The conference room was smaller, more intimate than the gymnasium. A few students had already formed a line to speak with the recruiter. Marcus waited his turn, observing the conversations ahead of him. Staff Sergeant Moreau gave each student her full attention, asking about their goals, their concerns, and their circumstances. When Marcus's turn came, he approached somewhat hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make any decisions," he began, "but I'd like to know more about the opportunities you mentioned." Staff Sergeant Moreau smiled warmly. "That's exactly the right approach. What's your name, and what are you studying?" "Marcus Hendricks. I'm majoring in economics." "Economics is an excellent field. What draws you to it?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "I want to understand how systems work, how resources are allocated, how decisions affect entire communities. I grew up in a neighborhood where economic decisions made by people in offices downtown had real consequences for families just trying to get by." "That's a sophisticated perspective," Staff Sergeant Moreau noted. "The military has numerous positions where that kind of analytical thinking would be valuable. Intelligence analysis, logistics planning, budget management. There are many ways to apply economic principles in military contexts." They talked for nearly 20 minutes about Marcus's background, his goals, and the various paths military service might offer. Staff Sergeant Moreau didn't pressure him to make any commitments, but she gave him materials to review and her contact information in case he had further questions. As Marcus left the conference room, he nearly collided with Cameron Richardson, who was standing just outside the door with a smirk on his face. "Let me guess," Cameron said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Thinking about joining up? Makes sense, I suppose." "Not many other options for someone in your situation." Marcus felt his face flush, but he kept his voice level. "I'm exploring all my options, including ones that might not be available to everyone." "Right, of course." Cameron's smile widened. "Well, good luck with that. I'm sure you'll find military life very suitable." The word suitable hung in the air like an insult. Marcus understood exactly what Cameron meant, that military service was appropriate for people like him, people who couldn't afford better alternatives, people who needed to earn their opportunities rather than inherit them. "Actually," Cameron continued, seemingly unable to resist twisting the knife, "my father was just saying how the military is perfect for people who need structure in their lives. People who didn't have the advantages growing up that might teach them discipline and responsibility." Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. I'm sure your father has many opinions about many things. He does indeed. Successful people usually do. Cameron adjusted his expensive watch. A graduation gift Marcus had heard him mention in class. Anyway, I should get going. I have a networking event with some alumni from my dad's fraternity. You understand. Connections are everything in the real world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Cameron walked away, Marcus stood in the hallway, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the casual cruelty behind them. The assumption that Marcus's circumstances were somehow a reflection of his character or capability. The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes and part-time work. Marcus had a job in the campus bookstore, shelving returns and helping students find textbooks. It was mindless work that paid barely above minimum wage, but it helped cover his expenses and gave him access to books he couldn't afford to buy. That evening, as he rode the bus home through the darkening city, Marcus found himself thinking about Staff Sergeant Moreau's words. She had spoken about service, about putting the needs of others before your own comfort. It was a concept that resonated with him, perhaps because he had been doing exactly that for most of his life. His studio apartment greeted him with its familiar silence. The single room served as bedroom, living room, and study space. A card table functioned as both a dining table and desk. The walls were bare except for a small mirror and a calendar from the previous year that he had forgotten to replace. Marcus heated a can of soup on his hot plate and settled down to review the materials Staff Sergeant Moreau had given him. The brochures were professional, filled with photographs of diverse, confident-looking service members engaged in various activities. Some were clearly in combat zones, but others showed people working with advanced technology, participating in humanitarian missions, or attending what appeared to be graduate-level courses. One brochure focused specifically on education opportunities. The military, it explained, would not only pay for college but also provide practical experience that would enhance academic learning. Service members could earn degrees while serving, often in fields directly related to their military specialties. Another brochure detailed career paths in intelligence and analysis. Marcus was surprised to learn about the sophisticated analytical work performed by military personnel, the advanced training provided, and the security clearances that would open doors in civilian careers after service. As he read, Marcus began to see military service not as a last resort for the desperate, but as a structured path toward goals he had always assumed were beyond his reach. The economic analysis he longed to do on a larger scale, the opportunity to work with cutting-edge technology, the chance to travel and gain perspectives that most of his classmates would never have. All of these seemed possible through military service. But he also thought about Cameron Richardson's words, about the assumptions people would make. Would military service confirm everyone's opinion that he was exactly what they thought? Someone with limited options taking the only path available to him? The question haunted him as he tried to focus on his homework. His microeconomics textbook was open to a chapter on human capital theory, the idea that individuals invest in education and training to increase their future earning potential. Military service, viewed through this lens, was simply another form of human capital investment. Yet Marcus knew that his classmates would never see it that way. To them, military service was what happened when human capital investments failed, when someone couldn't afford the traditional path of college, followed by a professional career. The next morning brought another day of classes, another series of subtle reminders of his place in the campus hierarchy. In his political science course, Professor David Chen led a discussion about civil-military relations that quickly devolved into a critique of American foreign policy. The volunteer military, Professor Chen explained, creates a problematic dynamic where the burden of military service falls disproportionately on certain segments of society. This can lead to what scholars call a warrior caste, a situation where military service becomes concentrated among specific demographic groups. Sarah Martinez, a student whose activist credentials were well known on campus, raised her hand. Doesn't that mean that people with privilege can essentially opt out of the consequences of the foreign policy decisions they support? They can vote for politicians who support military intervention while never having to risk their own lives or those of their children. Professor Chen nodded approvingly. Exactly the kind of critical thinking we need to apply to these issues. The all-volunteer force, while eliminating the social disruption of conscription, may have created new forms of inequality. Quote, Marcus listened to the discussion with growing discomfort. Once again, his classmates were discussing military service as something that happened to other people, as a policy problem to be analyzed rather than a personal choice to be respected. During the break, he overheard Sarah Martinez talking with several other students about the previous day's recruitment presentation. "I can't believe they're allowed to come on campus and prey on vulnerable students like that," Sarah was saying. "It's basically economic conscription." "My sociology professor calls it the poverty draft," added another student. "They deliberately target communities where people don't have other options." Marcus had heard enough. He approached the group, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Excuse me," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I attended that presentation yesterday, and I'm curious about your perspective." Sarah turned to him with the kind of smile activists reserved for potential converts. "Oh, hi, you're in our poli-sci class, right? I'm Sarah. Listen, I hope you didn't get caught up in their recruitment pitch. Those people are very good at making military service sound appealing to students who are struggling financially." "What makes you think the students who attended were struggling financially?" Marcus asked. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Well, that's who these recruiters target. They don't waste time trying to recruit students who have other options." "How do you know what options the students had?" The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Students from middle-class families don't need to consider military service to pay for college." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice controlled. "So you're saying that anyone who considers military service must be desperate? That it couldn't possibly be a thoughtful choice based on genuine interest or a desire to serve?" "No, of course not," Sarah backtracked. "I'm sure some people genuinely want to serve their country. But we have to acknowledge the economic realities. The military recruitment system is designed to exploit economic inequality. Have you ever considered that some people might view military service as an opportunity rather than exploitation?" Sarah's activist training kicked in. "Look, I'm not trying to shame anyone for the choices they make given their circumstances. I'm critiquing the system that limits those choices in the first place." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand. You're saying that people like me, people from certain circumstances, don't really have choices at all. We just think we do." The condescension in his voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah seemed to realize she had walked into uncomfortable territory. "That's not what I meant." "But it is what you said." Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "You've decided that anyone who might consider military service must be a victim of economic circumstances, incapable of making an autonomous decision about their own future." The other students in the group shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of conversation they were used to having with someone they had assumed shared their perspective. Marcus continued, "What if I told you that I'm considering military service not because I'm desperate, but because it offers opportunities I find genuinely appealing? Would that challenge your assumptions?" Sarah tried to recover. "Of course, if that's your genuine motivation, then I support your right to make that choice. I just think we need to be honest about the broader context." "The broader context," Marcus repeated. "You mean the context where people like me are presumed to have limited agency, where our choices are seen as reactions to circumstances, rather than reflections of our values and goals." The conversation had attracted the attention of other students, and Marcus realized he was drawing exactly the kind of attention he usually tried to avoid. But something had shifted inside him, a growing refusal to accept the role others had assigned to him. The following week brought an unexpected development that would change everything. Professor Hartwell announced a semester-long research project that would count for 40% of their final grade. Students were required to work in pairs, analyzing a specific economic policy and presenting their findings to a panel that would include several local business leaders and policy experts. "I'll be assigning the pairs randomly," Dr. Hartwell declared, causing a ripple of anxiety through the classroom. "This will simulate real-world conditions where you don't always get to choose your collaborators." Marcus watched as she pulled names from a basket, already knowing his luck wouldn't place him with someone who might appreciate his work ethic. When she called Marcus Hendricks and Cameron Richardson, he felt his stomach drop. Cameron's expression was priceless, a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed horror. He raised his hand immediately. Professor, I was wondering if there might be any flexibility with the partnerships. I have some family commitments that might make collaboration challenging with certain schedules. Dr. Hartwell's smile was sharp. Mr. Richardson, I'm sure you and Mr. Hendricks can find a way to make your schedules compatible. That's part of the learning experience. After class, Cameron approached Marcus with poorly disguised reluctance. Look, I know this isn't ideal for either of us. How about we divide the work in half? You can handle the research and data analysis, and I'll take care of the presentation and write-up. Marcus understood exactly what Cameron was proposing. Marcus would do the difficult analytical work, while Cameron would get credit for the polished final product that would be seen by the professors and business leaders. I think we should work together on all aspects, Marcus replied evenly. That's what collaboration means. Cameron's jaw tightened. Fine. But I want you to know that my father knows several people who might be on that evaluation panel. This project could have implications beyond just our grade. The threat was subtle but clear. Cameron was suggesting that Marcus's performance could affect his standing with local business leaders who might influence his future opportunities. Over the next few days, Marcus threw himself into researching their assigned topic, the economic impact of defense spending on local communities. It was a subject that fascinated him, particularly as he learned about the complex relationships between military installations, local economies, and regional development. He discovered that Millbrook County, where their college was located, had a long history with the military. During World War II, it had been home to a major training facility. In the decades since, several defense contractors had established operations in the area, employing thousands of people in high-skilled manufacturing and engineering jobs. When Marcus and Cameron met at the library to discuss their initial findings, Marcus came prepared with detailed analysis and dozens of sources. Cameron arrived 20 minutes late with a coffee and what appeared to be hastily printed Wikipedia pages. So what did you find? Cameron asked, settling into his chair with obvious discomfort at being in the library's quiet study section. Marcus opened his notebook, filled with careful handwriting and detailed charts. The relationship between defense spending and local economic development is more complex than most people realize. While military spending does create jobs and economic activity, the multiplier effects vary significantly based on the type of spending and the existing economic infrastructure. Cameron stared blankly. Multiplier effects? When the government spends money on defense contracts, that money doesn't just disappear. The contractors hire workers who spend their wages on housing, food, and other goods. Those businesses then hire more workers, creating a ripple effect through the local economy. Right, obviously. Cameron's tone suggested this was information he should have known. What else? Marcus continued, explaining his analysis of employment data, wage trends, and economic development patterns. He had identified several key findings that challenged conventional wisdom about military spending. Interesting, Cameron said, though his expression suggested he was struggling to follow the analysis. My father always says defense contractors are just corporate welfare for big businesses. The data suggests it's more nuanced than that, Marcus replied diplomatically. While there are certainly inefficiencies in defense spending, the economic impact on communities like this one has been substantial. Thousands of families depend on defense-related jobs, and many of those positions require advanced technical skills. Cameron shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the conversation he had expected to have with someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. Well, let's not get too far into the weeds, Cameron said. We need to think about how this will play with the evaluation panel. These are practical business people, not academics. Actually, I think they'll appreciate rigorous analysis backed by solid data. Trust me, Cameron said, his privileged confidence reasserting itself. I know how to talk to these people. My father has been dealing with them for years. Their collaboration continued over the following weeks, with Marcus doing increasingly complex analysis while Cameron focused on what he called strategic presentation. Marcus documented the creation of over 8,000 jobs in the county directly related to defense spending, the establishment of a technical training program at the community college that had produced hundreds of skilled workers, and the downstream effects on local businesses. Cameron, meanwhile, worked on PowerPoint slides with lots of graphics and bullet points that simplified Marcus's findings into what he called digestible insights for busy executives. As the presentation date approached, Marcus noticed Cameron becoming increasingly nervous. Despite his claims about knowing how to handle business leaders, he seemed genuinely worried about defending their analysis under questioning. "Maybe you should handle more of the Q&A section," Cameron suggested during one of their practice sessions. "You know the technical details better than I do." Marcus agreed, though he suspected Cameron's real concern was that his superficial grasp of their research would be exposed in front of people who might actually understand the subject matter. The day of their presentation arrived with an unseasonably warm October morning. The conference room in the business building had been set up with a long table where 5 evaluators sat: Dr. Hartwell, Dean Patricia Kowalski, and 3 local business leaders Marcus didn't recognize. As Marcus and Cameron took their positions at the front of the room, Marcus noticed Cameron's hands were shaking slightly as he shuffled his notes. "Good morning," Cameron began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone raised for public speaking. "Today we'll be presenting our analysis of defense spending's economic impact on Millbrook County." Cameron delivered the first portion of their presentation smoothly, hitting the key points they had rehearsed, but Marcus could see the shallow understanding beneath the polished delivery. When Cameron transitioned to introduce him, there was relief in his voice. "My partner Marcus will now present our detailed findings and analysis." Marcus stepped forward, and something shifted in the room's energy. Unlike Cameron's presentation style, which felt rehearsed and performative, Marcus spoke with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who truly understood his subject. "Our analysis identified 3 primary mechanisms through which defense spending impacts local economic development," he began, his nervousness evaporating as he delved into material he knew intimately. He walked the evaluators through complex economic relationships with clarity and precision, using data to support every claim. When he discussed employment multipliers, he didn't just cite numbers. He explained what they meant for real families and real communities. "For example," Marcus continued, "when Hartwell Defense Systems expanded their operations in 2019, they hired 200 new employees. Our analysis shows that this direct employment created an additional 340 indirect jobs in the local economy, as those workers spent their wages on housing, groceries, healthcare, and other services." One of the business leaders, an older woman Marcus didn't recognize, leaned forward with interest. "That's a significant multiplier effect. How did you calculate those numbers?" Marcus launched into an explanation of his methodology, citing specific data sources and explaining how he had controlled for other economic variables. His analysis was sophisticated, far beyond what anyone would expect from an undergraduate student. The questions continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Marcus fielding increasingly complex inquiries about economic theory, statistical methods, and policy implications. Cameron stood beside him, occasionally nodding but clearly out of his depth. "Mr. Hendricks," said one of the male evaluators, "your analysis of the relationship between defense spending and regional innovation clusters is particularly insightful. Have you considered how this might apply to other types of federal investment?" "That's an excellent question," Marcus replied. "The framework we developed could certainly be applied to infrastructure spending, research grants, or other forms of federal investment. The key is understanding how different types of spending create different patterns of economic activity." After their presentation ended, and they had left the conference room, Cameron was unusually quiet. As they walked across campus, he finally spoke. "Where did you learn to do analysis like that?" Marcus looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that wasn't undergraduate level work. You were talking with those business leaders like you were already an expert in the field." "I've been studying economics for a while," Marcus replied simply. "But how? I mean, where did you get the background to understand all that complex stuff about multiplier effects and regional development?" Quote, Marcus realized that Cameron genuinely couldn't comprehend how someone from his background could possess sophisticated analytical skills. The assumption was that intelligence and expertise were somehow correlated with economic privilege. "I read," Marcus said. "I've been interested in economics since high school, so I've spent a lot of time studying it on my own." Cameron shook his head. "It's not just reading, though. You were answering questions like you had real-world experience with this stuff." There was something in Cameron's tone that Marcus found troubling, not just confusion, but a hint of suspicion, as if Marcus had somehow cheated or misrepresented himself. Their project received the highest grade in the class, with Dr. Hartwell specifically noting the sophistication of their economic analysis. But instead of celebration, Marcus noticed a shift in how some of his classmates looked at him. Word had spread about his performance during the presentation, and it seemed to make people uncomfortable. The reaction crystallized during their next political science class, when Professor Chen was discussing the economic dimensions of national security policy. Military spending, Professor Chen explained, represents a significant opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on defense is a dollar that could have been invested in education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Marcus raised his hand, something he rarely did in this class. Professor, I think that analysis might be oversimplified. Military spending can actually complement other forms of public investment, particularly in terms of technological development and workforce training. Professor Chen looked surprised. Could you elaborate on that, Mr. Hendricks? Defense spending often drives innovation that has civilian applications. GPS technology, the internet, advanced manufacturing techniques, many of these emerged from military research and development. Additionally, military training programs often provide technical education that directly benefits the civilian workforce. Sarah Martinez turned in her seat to look at him with obvious confusion. But Marcus, you can't seriously be defending the military-industrial complex. We've talked about how military recruitment exploits economic inequality. I'm not defending or attacking anything, Marcus replied calmly. I'm pointing out that the economic analysis is more complex than simple opportunity cost calculations suggest. Quote, Professor Chen seemed intrigued by the direction of the discussion. Mr. Hendricks, you seem to have given this considerable thought. What's your source for these insights? Marcus hesitated. He could mention his recent research project, but that would only reinforce the impression that his knowledge was purely academic. Instead, he chose a different approach. I've been studying the economic impact of defense spending on local communities. The relationship between military installations, defense contractors, and regional development is more nuanced than most policy discussions acknowledge. Cameron Richardson, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. Marcus did incredible research on this topic. His analysis was graduate-level work. There was something odd in Cameron's tone, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Marcus realized that Cameron was struggling to reconcile his assumptions about Marcus's background with the evidence of his capabilities. After class, Marcus was approached by Dr. Sandra Kim, a professor he had never spoken to before. Dr. Kim taught upper-level courses in international relations and had a reputation as one of the most demanding faculty members in the department. Mr. Hendricks, I couldn't help but overhear your comments in Professor Chen's class. I'm curious. Have you considered graduate school? Marcus was taken aback by the question. I hadn't really thought about it as a realistic option. Why not? The question was simple, but Marcus found it difficult to answer without revealing more about his circumstances than he wanted to. Graduate school is expensive, and I'd need to work to support myself. Dr. Kim nodded thoughtfully. There are funding opportunities available for strong students. Research assistantships, teaching positions, fellowships. Have you looked into any of these? Not really, Marcus admitted. You should. Based on what I heard today, you have the kind of analytical mind that would do well in graduate-level research. She handed him her business card. Come see me during office hours. I'd like to discuss some possibilities with you. As Marcus walked home that evening, he found himself thinking about Dr. Kim's suggestion. Graduate school had always seemed like something for other people. People with different backgrounds, different resources, different assumptions about their place in the world. But maybe those assumptions were limiting him more than his actual circumstances were. The bus ride home took him through neighborhoods that most of his classmates never saw, past abandoned storefronts, housing projects, and industrial areas where people worked jobs that kept the city running but rarely brought recognition or respect. Marcus had grown up in these neighborhoods, among people who understood that survival required intelligence, resourcefulness, and strength that affluent people never had to develop. His classmates talked about economic inequality as an abstract policy problem, but Marcus had lived with its daily realities. Yet something was shifting in how he understood his own story. For years, he had accepted other people's assumptions about what his background meant for his future. He had internalized the idea that his circumstances limited his options, that people like him were lucky to get basic opportunities, let alone extraordinary ones. Dr. Kim's question, "Why not?" echoed in his mind as he climbed the stairs to his studio apartment. Why not graduate school? Why not research that could influence policy? Why not a career that utilized his analytical abilities to their fullest extent? The materials Staff Sergeant Moreau had given him were still sitting on his card table, and Marcus found himself looking at them with new eyes. Military service wasn't just about economic necessity or patriotic duty. It could be a strategic choice that opened doors he hadn't even considered. But first he needed to understand more about those doors, and who might be willing to help him walk through them. The following Monday brought news that would accelerate everything. Dr. Kim had submitted Marcus's research project to the Regional Economics Conference, an annual gathering of academics, policymakers, and business leaders from across the tri-state area. His paper had been accepted not just for presentation, but as a featured research highlight. "This is quite unusual," Dr. Kim explained during their meeting in her office, which was lined floor to ceiling with books on international relations and defense policy. "Undergraduate work is rarely selected for this conference, let alone featured. Your analysis caught the attention of some very influential people." Marcus sat in the comfortable leather chair across from her desk, still processing the information. "What exactly does this mean?" Quote, "It means you'll be presenting your research to an audience that includes senior economists from major corporations, policy analysts from think tanks, and researchers from top-tier universities. It's the kind of exposure that typically comes much later in an academic career." The conference was scheduled for the following month, giving Marcus just 4 weeks to prepare. Dr. Kim offered to help him refine his presentation and navigate the professional networking that would be crucial to his future opportunities. But first, she had questions about his background that no one had asked before. "Marcus, your research methodology is quite sophisticated. Where did you develop these analytical skills?" It was the same question Cameron had asked, but coming from Dr. Kim, it felt different. Not suspicious, but genuinely curious about his intellectual development. "I've always been interested in how systems work," Marcus replied carefully. "Economics appeals to me because it helps explain why some communities thrive while others struggle." Dr. Kim nodded. "That's a mature perspective. But the technical skills you demonstrated, the statistical analysis, the complex modeling, where did you learn those?" Marcus realized he was at a crossroads. He could continue giving vague answers, or he could trust Dr. Kim with more of his story. "I taught myself most of it," he said finally. "I've been working since I was 16, but I spent my breaks and evenings reading economics textbooks and teaching myself statistical software. When you grow up watching policy decisions affect your neighborhood, you develop a strong motivation to understand how those decisions get made." Dr. Kim leaned back in her chair, studying him with new interest. "Self-taught. That explains some things about your approach. It's more intuitive, less constrained by conventional academic frameworks." Over the next few weeks, Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time in Dr. Kim's office, working on his conference presentation, but also engaging in broader discussions about economics, politics, and policy. She pushed him to think more deeply about his research implications and helped him understand how academic careers actually developed. "The conference will expose you to opportunities you probably haven't considered," she explained one afternoon. "Graduate fellowships, research positions, internships with policy organizations. But you need to be prepared to advocate for yourself." Quote, "What do you mean?" "Academic and policy circles can be insular. People tend to assume that talent emerges from predictable backgrounds. When someone appears with exceptional abilities, but an unconventional path, it can make people uncomfortable." Marcus understood exactly what she meant. He had seen that discomfort in Cameron's eyes, in the surprised reactions of his classmates when he demonstrated analytical abilities they hadn't expected. "The key," Dr. Kim continued, "is to own your story. Don't apologize for your background. Use it as a source of insight that others lack." Meanwhile, word of Marcus's conference selection had spread through the political science department, creating an interesting dynamic among his classmates. Some seemed genuinely impressed and supportive. Others, particularly those who had assumed intellectual superiority based on their privileged backgrounds, appeared confused or even resentful. Sarah Martinez approached him after class one day with what appeared to be genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been guilt. "Marcus, I heard about your conference presentation. That's really impressive." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. I've been thinking about our conversation a few weeks ago about military recruitment and economic circumstances. I may have made some assumptions that weren't fair. Marcus appreciated the attempt at reconciliation, even if he sensed it came more from social pressure than genuine insight. I appreciate that, Sarah. I think we all make assumptions sometimes. I'm curious, though, how did you develop such expertise in economic analysis? It's obviously way beyond what any of us are doing in our coursework. The question again. Marcus realized that his classmates were struggling to fit him into their existing categories for understanding social class, intelligence, and opportunity. I've had a lot of time to study, he replied diplomatically. When you work jobs that don't require much mental engagement, you can spend a lot of time thinking about bigger questions. It was a partial truth, but one that seemed to satisfy Sarah's need for explanation. Cameron Richardson's reaction was more complex. Since their successful collaboration, he had been treating Marcus with a mixture of respect and wariness, as if trying to recalibrate his entire worldview. I keep thinking about your presentation, Cameron said one day as they walked across campus. My father was asking about you after he heard about the conference selection. Your father? Yeah, he knows some people who were on the evaluation panel for our project. Word gets around in business circles. Cameron paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. He said something interesting. He said your analysis reminded him of work he'd seen from military intelligence analysts. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. That's an interesting comparison. He spent some time in the Army Reserves when he was younger, so he's familiar with that kind of analytical approach. Cameron studied Marcus's face. It got me wondering about your background. You know things about defense economics that seem pretty specialized. The conversation was heading into dangerous territory. Marcus had worked hard to keep his family history private, partly because he wasn't sure how people would react, and partly because he had never been certain how much of that history was his story to tell. I read widely, Marcus said, using his standard deflection. But Cameron wasn't satisfied. It's not just reading, though. You understand the operational side of things, the way military spending actually works in practice. That's not something you get from textbooks. Before Marcus could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hartwell, who had apparently been looking for them. Mr. Hendricks, Mr. Richardson, I'm glad I found you both. I wanted to discuss the implications of your project's success. She gestured for them to follow her toward the faculty building. Marcus, your conference selection has attracted attention from some very interesting quarters. In her office, Dr. Hartwell explained that several organizations had reached out after learning about Marcus's research. A Washington-based think tank specializing in defense economics wanted to offer him a summer internship. A regional development authority was interested in hiring him as a research consultant. Most significantly, the Pentagon's Office of Economic Adjustment had inquired about his availability for a graduate research fellowship. These are extraordinary opportunities, Dr. Hartwell emphasized, the kind that typically go to graduate students from elite institutions. Cameron's confusion was now visible. How do they even know about Marcus's work? Academic networks are smaller than you might think, Dr. Hartwell replied. When exceptional work appears, word spreads quickly. After they left Dr. Hartwell's office, Cameron's questions became more direct. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take it the wrong way. He stopped walking and turned to face him. Is there something about your background that you haven't told people? Because the level of interest you're getting? It's not normal for an undergraduate, especially one from a community college. Marcus realized he was approaching a moment of truth. The careful boundaries he had maintained around his personal history were becoming impossible to sustain. His academic success was forcing questions that his obscurity had previously allowed him to avoid. What makes you think there's something I haven't told people? Because nothing else makes sense, Cameron said, his frustration evident. Your analytical abilities, your understanding of defense economics, the way you handled those business leaders during our presentation, none of it fits with what I thought I knew about your background. And what did you think you knew about my background? Cameron had the grace to look uncomfortable. I assumed. Based on your circumstances, I thought. You thought that someone who works in a bookstore and lives in a studio apartment couldn't possibly understand complex economic analysis. That's not... Okay, maybe that is what I thought. But can you blame me? You never talk about your family, your history, where you're from. You show up knowing things that most people don't learn without specialized training or experience. Marcus found himself at a crossroads he had been avoiding for months. He could continue deflecting, maintaining the careful anonymity that had protected him from both unwanted attention and uncomfortable questions. Or he could trust Cameron, and by extension his broader social circle, with information that might change everything. The decision was made for him the next day when he received a phone call that he had been both expecting and dreading. "Marcus, this is Colonel Patricia Hendricks. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time." Marcus stepped outside the campus bookstore where he had been working, seeking privacy for a conversation he knew would be significant. "Hello, Aunt Patricia. No, it's fine. I was just finishing my shift. I heard some interesting news through military channels. Apparently, your research on defense economics has attracted some attention in Washington." Marcus shouldn't have been surprised that word had reached his family. The military's professional networks were extensive, and his aunt's position would give her access to information about emerging talent in defense-related fields. "It's just an undergraduate research project," Marcus said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. "Marcus, I've read your paper. It's sophisticated analysis that demonstrates understanding of issues most civilian economists never grasp. Where did you develop that knowledge?" It was the question everyone kept asking, but coming from Colonel Hendricks, it carried different implications. "You know where I developed it, Aunt Patricia. Growing up in our family, listening to dinner-table conversations about logistics, strategic planning, and resource allocation. I may not have served, but I've been absorbing military perspectives on economics my entire life." There was a long pause before she responded. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your future, Marcus, and about whether you're ready to stop hiding from your heritage." That evening, Marcus sat in his studio apartment staring at his phone, debating whether to make a call that would change everything. His conversation with Colonel Hendricks had clarified something he had been avoiding. His academic success was forcing him toward a reckoning with his family history that he could no longer postpone. The next morning brought another surprise. Dr. Kim was waiting for him outside his first class with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Marcus, we need to talk immediately. I just received a call from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They want to meet with you." "DARPA? Why would they want to meet with me?" "Your research paper has been circulating through some very high-level channels. Apparently, your analysis of economic multiplier effects in defense spending caught the attention of people who developed those policies." As they walked toward her office, Dr. Kim explained that DARPA was interested in Marcus not just as a researcher, but as someone who understood the intersection of military operations and economic theory. "They specifically mentioned that your approach suggests familiarity with operational realities that most academic economists lack," she said. "They want to know how an undergraduate student developed such insights." Quote, Marcus realized that his carefully maintained anonymity was crumbling from multiple directions simultaneously. His academic success had created visibility that made his background impossible to ignore. In Dr. Kim's office, she handed him a formal letter on DARPA letterhead. "They're offering you a summer research position that would give you access to classified economic data about defense spending patterns. It's an extraordinary opportunity, but it would require a security clearance investigation." Marcus stared at the letter, understanding its implications immediately. A security clearance investigation would reveal everything about his background that he had worked to keep private. His family history, his connections to the military establishment, his reasons for choosing anonymity over the opportunities his heritage could have provided. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said finally. Dr. Kim settled back in her chair, clearly prepared for revelations that would explain the mysteries surrounding her most enigmatic student. "I'm listening." Marcus took a deep breath and looked directly at Dr. Kim. "My full name is Marcus Jonathan Hendricks. My father was Major General Robert Hendricks, and my aunt is Colonel Patricia Hendricks, currently serving as Deputy Director of Strategic Planning at the Pentagon." The silence in Dr. Kim's office stretched for nearly 30 seconds. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her expression cycling through surprise, comprehension, and what might have been embarrassment. "Your father was General Robert Hendricks, the General Hendricks who revolutionized military logistics during the Iraq conflict?" "Yes." "And you've been attending community college, working in a bookstore, living in—" Dr. Kim paused, clearly recalibrating everything she thought she knew about Marcus's circumstances. "Living in a studio apartment in the worst part of town. Marcus finished. By choice. Dr. Kim leaned back in her chair, studying him with new eyes. This explains so much about your research approach, your understanding of defense economics, your analytical sophistication. But it raises even more questions. Marcus had anticipated this conversation for months, but actually having it felt surreal. What questions? Why? Why choose poverty when you could have had access to elite institutions, military connections, opportunities that most people can only dream of? Quote, the question struck at the heart of everything Marcus had been grappling with since starting college. How do you explain to someone that privilege can feel like a prison when it comes with expectations you're not sure you want to meet? Because I wanted to earn whatever I achieved, Marcus said finally. I wanted to know that my success was based on my abilities, not my family connections. But Marcus, you could have had both. You could have used your family's connections and proven your abilities at the highest levels. Could I have? Or would everyone have always wondered whether I was just another legacy case riding on family reputation? Dr. Kim considered this carefully. There's merit to that concern, but the cost seems enormous. You've been essentially living in poverty, working jobs far below your capabilities, limiting your opportunities. I've been learning things that I never would have learned otherwise, Marcus interrupted. I understand economic inequality from the inside now, not just from academic theory. I know what it feels like when every dollar matters, when opportunities are scarce, when people make assumptions about your worth based on your circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Dr. Kim's door. Her assistant peered in apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's Colonel Hendricks here to see Marcus. She says it's urgent. Dr. Kim's eyes widened. Your aunt? Apparently she decided not to wait for me to call her back, Marcus said, feeling his carefully controlled world spinning further out of his grasp. Colonel Patricia Hendricks entered the office with the bearing that had made her one of the youngest female colonels in the Army's Strategic Planning Division. At 48, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Her civilian clothes couldn't disguise the military precision in her posture and movements. Dr. Kim, I presume? I'm Patricia Hendricks. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but my nephew has been avoiding my calls. Dr. Kim stood immediately, clearly recognizing the presence of someone whose opinions carried significant weight in policy circles. Colonel Hendricks, it's an honor. I've read your work on strategic resource allocation, and I've read Marcus's research paper, which is why I'm here. Patricia turned to Marcus with an expression that mixed family affection with professional frustration. We need to talk about your future, and about why you've been hiding from opportunities that could benefit both you and your country. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Marcus was no longer Dr. Kim's promising but mysterious student, and Dr. Kim was no longer in control of the conversation. Patricia Hendricks commanded attention simply by existing. Marcus has been explaining his reasoning for choosing his current path, Dr. Kim said carefully. Patricia's smile was sharp. His reasoning? Yes, I'm familiar with Marcus's philosophical objections to what he calls unearned privilege. It's an admirable sentiment, but it's becoming a luxury that neither he nor the country can afford. What do you mean? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. I mean that DARPA's interest in you isn't casual curiosity. They need analysts who understand both economic theory and operational realities. The intersection of those skill sets is extremely rare, especially in someone young enough to develop into a long-term strategic asset. Patricia moved to the window, looking out at the campus where Marcus had been playing the role of an ordinary student. Your research paper has been circulated at levels you probably can't imagine. The Deputy Secretary of Defense has personally reviewed it. The National Security Council's economic advisors want to meet with you. Marcus felt the weight of implications settling around him. And if I'm not interested? Then you're wasting capabilities that could make a real difference in national security, and you're doing it for reasons that amount to intellectual pride. Dr. Kim watched this family dynamic with obvious fascination. The conversation was revealing layers of complexity she hadn't anticipated. Colonel Hendricks, she interjected, if I may ask, what exactly are you proposing for Marcus? Patricia turned back to face them both. I'm proposing that Marcus stop pretending to be someone he isn't and start using his actual capabilities for purposes that matter. Such as? Graduate school at Georgetown or George Washington University, full funding, with a research focus on defense economics. Summer internships with the National Security Council. fast-track security clearance processing, access to classified economic data that would allow him to conduct research with real policy implications. Quote, "The offer was extraordinary, exactly the kind of opportunity that ambitious students spent years positioning themselves to receive. But Marcus found himself hesitating for reasons he struggled to articulate. And in exchange? In exchange, you stop hiding your family background and accept that your insights come partly from your heritage. You acknowledge that your understanding of military operations and strategic thinking wasn't developed in a vacuum." Dr. Kim looked between them, clearly trying to understand the family dynamics at play. "Marcus, this sounds like an incredible opportunity. What are your concerns?" Marcus struggled to find words for feelings that had been driving his decisions for years. "If I accept these opportunities, how do I know that my success is really mine? How do I know that I'm not just fulfilling expectations based on family reputation rather than proving my own capabilities?" Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Marcus, do you think your research paper succeeded because of your family name? Do you think Dr. Kim recommended you for the conference because she knew about your background? Do you think DARPA is interested in you because of nepotism? No, but then you've already proven your capabilities independently. The question now is whether you're going to use those capabilities effectively or continue this performance of artificial disadvantage." The phrase artificial disadvantage stung because Marcus recognized its accuracy. He had deliberately chosen limitations that weren't imposed by circumstances, but by his own philosophical principles. Dr. Kim spoke carefully. "Marcus, I understand your concerns about earned versus unearned success. But there's another way to think about this. Your family background gave you insights that inform your research, but it didn't write your papers or develop your analytical methods. Those achievements are genuinely yours." Furthermore, Patricia added, "continuing to hide your background is becoming counterproductive. The security clearance investigation will reveal everything anyway. You can either control how that information emerges, or let it surprise people who are already invested in your success." Marcus realized he was facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could continue his experiment in voluntary poverty and prove his independence, but at the cost of limiting his impact on issues he genuinely cared about. Or he could accept opportunities that aligned with his interests and abilities, but risk forever wondering whether his success was truly his own. "There's something else," Patricia said, her tone becoming more serious. "The national security implications of economic policy are becoming increasingly complex. We need analysts who can bridge the gap between academic theory and operational reality. Your research suggests you could be one of those people." "What do you mean by operational reality?" "I mean understanding how economic policies affect military readiness, how resource allocation decisions impact strategic capabilities, how civilian economic trends influence military recruitment and retention." Patricia moved closer, her voice taking on the urgency of someone discussing matters of national importance. "These aren't abstract academic questions anymore. They're immediate policy challenges that require sophisticated analysis." Dr. Kim nodded thoughtfully. "That aligns with some trends I've been observing in defense policy research. The traditional boundaries between economic analysis and security studies are breaking down." "Exactly," Patricia continued. "And Marcus has demonstrated analytical capabilities that could contribute to those evolving fields, but not if he continues working in a bookstore and limiting himself to undergraduate coursework." Marcus felt the familiar tension between his desire for independence and his recognition of larger responsibilities. "If I accept these opportunities, what happens to the other students here? The ones who don't have family connections, who are struggling with the same financial pressures I've been experiencing?" It was Patricia's turn to look surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've learned things over the past year about how economic inequality affects educational opportunities. I've seen how students make career decisions based on financial constraints rather than interests or abilities. If I just walk away from that and accept privileges that other students don't have access to, what does that accomplish?" Dr. Kim's expression brightened with understanding. "You're thinking about policy implications." "I'm thinking about the fact that there are probably dozens of students with analytical capabilities who never get the chance to develop them because they don't have the right family backgrounds or economic circumstances." Patricia studied her nephew with what might have been pride. "So what are you proposing?" Marcus felt pieces of a plan forming in his mind. What if accepting these opportunities came with a commitment to addressing the broader issues? Research that focuses on how military recruitment and defense spending could be structured to create more equitable opportunities for capable students. You want to use your access to classified economic data to study military recruitment patterns? I want to use whatever access I'm given to understand how national security policies could better serve both security interests and social equity. The room fell silent as both Patricia and Dr. Kim considered the implications of what Marcus was proposing. He wasn't just asking to accept family connections. He was suggesting a research agenda that could influence policy at the highest levels. Dr. Kim spoke first. That's an ambitious research program. It would require sophisticated understanding of both military operations and socioeconomic theory. Which is exactly what Marcus has been developing, Patricia added, her military strategist's mind clearly working through possibilities. And it's research that could have real policy impact if conducted at the right institutional level. Marcus realized he was proposing something that felt authentic to both his capabilities and his values. Instead of choosing between independent achievement and family advantages, he was suggesting a path that used those advantages for purposes that aligned with his broader concerns. So what would this actually look like, he asked. Patricia's smile was the first genuine one Marcus had seen from her during the entire conversation. It would look like you accepting that your heritage is an asset rather than a burden, and using it to accomplish things that matter. Word of Marcus's true identity spread through Westfield Community College like wildfire, though not in the way he had expected. Rather than learning it through gossip or speculation, his classmates discovered it through an article in the Washington Defense Journal that featured his upcoming conference presentation. The headline read, "Rising Star in Defense Economics, General Sun Brings Fresh Perspective to Military Spending Analysis." Below it was a professional headshot that Patricia had somehow arranged, along with a detailed biography that made Marcus's academic achievements sound even more impressive than they actually were. Sarah Martinez found him in the library that Tuesday morning holding a printed copy of the article with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Marcus? Is this really you?" She sat down across from him at the study table where he had been working on his conference presentation. Marcus looked at the article, recognizing his aunt's handiwork in every carefully crafted paragraph. "Yes, that's me. Your father was Major General Robert Hendricks, the one who wrote the definitive analysis of logistics optimization in asymmetric warfare?" Marcus was surprised that Sarah even knew about his father's published work. "You're familiar with his research?" "My political science professor assigned one of his papers last semester. It was brilliant, way ahead of its time in understanding how economic principles could improve military efficiency." Sarah's voice carried a tone Marcus had never heard from her before. Genuine respect mixed with confusion. "But Marcus, if this is your background, why are you here? Why community college? Why work in the bookstore?" Before Marcus could answer, Cameron Richardson appeared at their table, apparently having been looking for them both. He was carrying the same article, but his expression was more complex than Sarah's simple bewilderment. "We need to talk," Cameron said, his voice tight with emotions Marcus couldn't immediately identify. "About what?" Cameron sat down heavily in the chair next to Sarah. "About the fact that you've been letting me treat you like a charity case for an entire semester when you have more connections in Washington than my father could dream of." The accusation hung in the air between them. Marcus realized that Cameron felt humiliated, not just by learning about Marcus's background, but by the memory of his own condescending behavior. "I never asked you to treat me any particular way," Marcus replied carefully. "That's not the point," Cameron shot back. "The point is that you let me make assumptions. You let me think I was superior to you the entire time you could have made one phone call and had opportunities that I'll never have access to." Sarah looked between them, clearly trying to process the dynamics of this conversation. "Cameron, you're acting like Marcus deceived you somehow. Maybe he just wanted to be treated as an individual, rather than as someone's son." "Easy for you to say," Cameron replied. "You weren't the one making an ass of yourself by explaining how people like him don't understand the business world." Marcus felt an unexpected sympathy for Cameron's embarrassment. "Cameron, you weren't the only one making assumptions. I made assumptions about you too." "Such as?" "I assumed that your success was entirely due to your family's wealth and connections, that you hadn't earned any of your opportunities through your own efforts." Cameron's anger seemed to deflate slightly. "Wasn't it?" The question was asked with genuine uncertainty, as if Cameron was seriously questioning the sources of his own achievements for the first time. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "But our research project showed me that you have analytical capabilities I hadn't given you credit for. You understood the strategic implications of our findings in ways that had nothing to do with your family background." Sarah watched this exchange with growing interest. "This is fascinating. You've both been dealing with questions about earned versus inherited advantages, just from opposite directions." Over the following days, news of Marcus's identity created ripple effects throughout the campus community. Some students seemed impressed by his accomplishments, others appeared to feel deceived by his concealment of his background, and still others acted as if his true identity confirmed suspicions they had harbored all along. Professor Chen's reaction was particularly complex. During their next political science class, he addressed the situation directly. "I understand that some of you have learned new information about one of your classmates that might affect how you think about our previous discussions," he began, clearly referring to Marcus without naming him. "This presents an interesting case study in how personal background influences perspective on policy issues." Marcus felt every eye in the classroom turned toward him. He had become an object of academic analysis in real time. "Mr. Hendricks," Professor Chen continued, "would you be willing to reflect on how your family background has influenced your perspectives on civil-military relations?" It was a fair question, but one that put Marcus in an impossible position. Anything he said would be analyzed for evidence of bias, privilege, or hidden agendas. "I think my perspective has been influenced by multiple factors," Marcus replied carefully. "My family background gave me insights into military operations, but my recent experiences have taught me about economic constraints that affect military recruitment and retention." "Can you elaborate on that?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "Military families often understand the practical realities of defense policy in ways that purely academic analysis might miss. But living with financial constraints has taught me how economic factors influence young people's decisions about military service." Sarah raised her hand. "Marcus, do you think your year of living as a working-class student was just tourism? Like, were you playing at being poor while knowing you could call your family if things got really difficult?" The question was sharp, and Marcus recognized that Sarah was grappling with her own assumptions about authenticity and privilege. "That's a fair question," Marcus said. "I made a commitment to myself not to use family resources, but you're right that knowing those resources existed was a form of security that other students don't have." Cameron spoke up unexpectedly. "But he didn't use that security. I watched him eat ramen noodles for lunch every day and take buses instead of having a car. If he was just playing at being poor, he was really committed to the performance." Dr. Hartwell had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest. "This raises important questions about how personal experience influences analytical perspective. Mr. Hendricks, do you think your research would have been different if you had been open about your background from the beginning?" "Probably," Marcus admitted. "I might have had more confidence to pursue ambitious topics, but I also might have missed insights that came from experiencing economic constraints firsthand." The conversation continued for the remainder of the class period, with Marcus finding himself in the unusual position of being both a student and a case study simultaneously. When class ended, he was emotionally exhausted from the constant analysis of his motivations and choices. Dr. Kim was waiting for him outside the classroom with news that would complicate his situation even further. "Marcus, I just received a call from the Georgetown University Graduate School. They want to offer you immediate admission to their PhD program in international economics, with full funding and a research assistantship that would give you access to classified defense spending data." Quote, Marcus had expected this conversation after his meeting with Patricia, but the reality of it was overwhelming. When would this start? "They're offering you the option to begin in January, which would mean leaving Westfield at the end of this semester." The timing was jarring. Marcus had been planning to complete his undergraduate degree, but the opportunities his aunt had arranged were moving faster than academic calendars typically allowed. "There's more," Dr. Kim continued. "The National Security Council wants to interview you for a research position that would run concurrent with your graduate studies. You would essentially be conducting PhD research on defense economics while working directly with policymakers who implement those policies." As they walked toward her office, Marcus realized that his carefully planned transition was accelerating beyond his control. Decisions he had thought he would have months to consider were being compressed into weeks. "Dr. Kim, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Do you think I'm making the right choice?" moving from community college directly into high-level policy research. She considered the question carefully. Marcus, I think you've been ready for advanced work for longer than you've been willing to admit. The question isn't whether you're capable. Your research has already demonstrated that. The question is whether you're ready to stop proving yourself and start contributing at the level your capabilities warrant. That afternoon, Marcus called Colonel Hendricks to discuss the accelerating timeline. Aunt Patricia, these opportunities are moving very fast. I'm not sure I'm prepared for the transition. What kind of preparation do you think you need? I don't know. More time to process the implications, maybe. More time to complete my degree here. Patricia's voice carried the patience of someone accustomed to guiding younger officers through career transitions. Marcus, in military planning, we distinguish between ideal timelines and operational necessities. These opportunities exist now because of current policy needs and political circumstances. Waiting for ideal conditions often means missing the window entirely. But what if I'm not ready? What if you are ready, and your hesitation is just another form of the self-doubt that led you to community college in the first place? The question hit harder than Marcus expected. He realized that some of his reluctance might indeed be rooted in the same impulses that had led him to choose artificial constraints over available opportunities. That evening, Cameron Richardson called him with an unexpected proposition. Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation, about assumptions and earned success. I have an idea that might interest you. What kind of idea? What if we continued collaborating on research, but in a way that addresses some of the issues you raised about economic inequality and opportunity? Marcus was intrigued despite himself. What do you mean? I mean, what if we used your new access to policy circles to research how defense spending could create more opportunities for students from different economic backgrounds? You understand the policy side now, and I understand the business implementation side. You want to research military recruitment equity? I want to research how economic policies could create more paths to success for people regardless of their family backgrounds, Cameron clarified. Military recruitment is just one aspect of that. Marcus found himself considering the proposal seriously. Cameron's business perspective could indeed complement his policy analysis, and their collaboration had already proven effective. Why would you want to do this? Cameron was quiet for a moment. Because our research project taught me that I don't actually know as much as I thought I did. And because I realized that some of the advantages I've had weren't entirely earned. Maybe I can use those advantages more constructively. The conversation gave Marcus an idea that began to resolve his concerns about accepting the opportunities Patricia had arranged. Instead of viewing those opportunities as personal advancement, he could frame them as platforms for research that would benefit others facing the kinds of constraints he had experienced. When he called Dr. Kim that evening to discuss his decision, she seemed unsurprised by his choice. Georgetown and the NSC position? Yes, but with a specific research focus that addresses economic equity in defense policies. That sounds like you've found a way to align your capabilities with your values. I think so, and Dr. Kim, thank you for pushing me to think beyond the limitations I had accepted. That's what mentors are for, Marcus, though I suspect you'll be mentoring others before long. Quote. As Marcus prepared for sleep that night in his studio apartment, which he would be leaving in just a few weeks, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had set out to prove that he could succeed independently of his family background, and in a way, he had accomplished that goal. But he had also learned that true independence might mean using all available resources, including family connections, for purposes larger than personal advancement. The view from his small window looked out over the neighborhood where he had chosen to live, where sirens and struggle were part of daily life. Soon he would be living in a different world, with access to classified information and policymakers who shaped national decisions. But he would carry with him the insights he had gained from this year of voluntary constraint, and those insights would inform research that could create opportunities for others. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Martinez. Whatever you decide about your future, I hope you know that you've changed how a lot of us think about assumptions and privilege. That matters. Marcus smiled as he turned off the light. Tomorrow he would begin the process of accepting a future he had spent a year avoiding, but he would do so with a clearer understanding of both his capabilities and his responsibilities. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the Pentagon's E-Ring conference room, wearing a suit that actually fit properly for the first time in years. The mahogany table stretched before him, surrounded by senior defense officials, NSC economists, and academic researchers whose work he had studied as an undergraduate. At 23, he was easily the youngest person in the room, but his research had earned him a seat at this table. "Mr. Hendricks," said Deputy Secretary of Defense Margaret Torres, "your preliminary findings on recruitment efficiency and economic mobility are quite compelling. Can you walk us through the methodology?" Marcus activated the presentation screen, displaying data visualizations that represented months of analysis using classified defense spending records. His research had evolved far beyond his original community college project into something that could influence military personnel policy at the highest levels. "Thank you, Madam Secretary. Our analysis examined recruitment patterns across 847 metropolitan statistical areas over a 15-year period, correlating military enlistment rates with local economic conditions, educational opportunities, and post-service career outcomes." As Marcus spoke, he caught sight of Colonel Hendricks sitting at the far end of the table. She had arranged for him to present his findings to this group, but she had made it clear that his success or failure would be entirely his own responsibility. "The key finding," Marcus continued, "is that military service can function as an economic mobility accelerator, but only when coupled with specific types of training and education programs. Current recruitment strategies aren't optimized to maximize either military effectiveness or long-term civilian career outcomes." General Raymond Foster, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean by optimized?" "I mean that we're recruiting based on immediate military needs without considering how military training could be structured to create more valuable human capital for both military and civilian applications." Marcus clicked to his next slide, showing a complex economic model that demonstrated how different types of military training created different patterns of post-service economic mobility. For example, soldiers trained in cybersecurity, logistics management, or advanced manufacturing develop skills that translate directly to high-paying civilian careers. But soldiers trained in combat roles often struggle with civilian job market transitions unless they receive additional technical education. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the National Security Council raised her hand. "Are you suggesting we should structure military training primarily around civilian career outcomes?" "Not primarily, but strategically. Military effectiveness should remain the priority, but there's significant overlap between military operational needs and civilian career skills. We could optimize training programs to serve both purposes." Deputy Secretary Torres studied the data carefully. What would this look like in practice? Marcus had anticipated this question and spent weeks developing concrete policy recommendations. 3 primary changes. First, expand technical training programs that serve both military and civilian needs. Second, create partnership programs with universities and employers that guarantee career pathways for veterans. Third, restructure recruitment to target not just economic necessity, but genuine aptitude and interest. "That third point interests me," said Colonel Patricia Morrison from Army Personnel Command. "How would targeting aptitude change recruitment outcomes?" Current recruitment disproportionately attracts people with limited economic alternatives. While military service provides valuable opportunities for these individuals, we're also missing potential recruits who might choose military service for other reasons: technological interest, leadership development, public service motivation. Marcus clicked to a slide showing demographic analysis that had required security clearance to access. "Our modeling suggests that broadening recruitment beyond economic necessity could increase both the quality of recruits and the diversity of skills they bring to military service." General Foster nodded thoughtfully. "This aligns with some strategic planning we've been discussing. The nature of military operations is changing in ways that require more technical sophistication from personnel at all levels." "Exactly," Marcus replied. "And if we structure training and career development properly, military service could become attractive to people who currently view it as a last resort rather than a strategic career choice." After the presentation concluded, Marcus found himself surrounded by officials wanting to discuss implementation details, research methodology, and policy implications. The conversations were exactly the kind of high-level strategic discussion he had dreamed about during his community college days. Colonel Hendricks approached him as the crowd around him began to thin. "Impressive work, Marcus. You've given them something concrete to act on." "Do you think they actually will act on it?" "I think you've identified problems they were already aware of and provided solutions they can implement. That's the best outcome any policy researcher can hope for." As they walked toward the Pentagon's main corridor, Patricia's expression grew more personal. "I owe you an apology." Marcus looked at her with surprise. "For what?" for assuming that your year at community college was just stubborn idealism. I understand now that you gained insights that informed this research in ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. You think the year was worthwhile. I think it was necessary. You needed to understand economic constraints from the inside, to develop empathy for the people affected by these policies. That empathy makes your research more than just academic analysis. It makes it advocacy for real people facing real choices. That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment near Georgetown University, a significant upgrade from his studio, but still modest by Washington standards. He had maintained his preference for living below his means, though now it was a choice about lifestyle rather than necessity. His phone rang as he was reviewing notes from the Pentagon presentation. The caller ID showed Cameron Richardson's name. Marcus, I just saw the Defense Department press release about your research recommendations. Congratulations. This is huge. Cameron had transferred to Georgetown's business school, and their collaboration had continued as he worked on the implementation side of economic mobility programs. His perspective on business partnerships and private sector engagement had proven valuable for translating Marcus's policy ideas into practical programs. Thanks. How are your meetings with the defense contractors going? Better than expected. It turns out that companies want access to well-trained veterans, especially in technical fields. The challenge isn't convincing them to participate. It's designing programs that serve both military and corporate needs. Cameron had surprised Marcus by embracing their research partnership with genuine enthusiasm. His initial embarrassment about his treatment of Marcus had evolved into dedication to addressing the broader issues their work had identified. I have some news that might interest you, Cameron continued. My father's company wants to pilot one of our training partnership programs. They're willing to guarantee job placement for veterans who complete specific technical certifications. It was exactly the kind of private sector engagement their research had recommended. That's excellent. Which technical areas? Advanced manufacturing and supply chain management. Apparently, the military training in logistics translates directly to civilian operations management. After ending the call with Cameron, Marcus opened his laptop to work on his doctoral dissertation, which was expanding his Pentagon research into a comprehensive analysis of military services economic policy. His advisor at Georgetown had been impressed by the real-world policy implications of his academic work. A knock at his door interrupted his writing. He opened it to find Sarah Martinez, who was now attending George Washington University's graduate program in public policy. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, she said. I wanted to talk to you about something. Of course, come in. Sarah had been one of the most thoughtful respondents to Marcus's revelation about his background. Instead of feeling deceived, she had used the experience to examine her own assumptions about privilege, authenticity, and social justice. I've been thinking about our conversations at Westfield, about assumptions and economic circumstances, she began as she settled into his small living room. Your research is starting to influence policy discussions in my program. How so? Professors are using your work as an example of how personal experience can inform policy analysis without compromising academic rigor. It's changing how people think about the relationship between researcher background and research validity. Marcus found this fascinating. What kinds of discussions are you having? Questions about whether policy researchers need lived experience with the issues they study, whether privileged backgrounds create blind spots in analysis, whether authenticity requires permanent identification with specific economic circumstances. These were exactly the questions Marcus had been grappling with since accepting his Georgetown position. What conclusions are you reaching? That it's more complex than simple categories allow. Your year at community college gave you insights that inform your current research, but your family background gave you access to implement that research at policy levels. Neither factor alone would have created the impact you're having. Sarah paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. I wanted to thank you for something. For what? For showing me that assumptions about authenticity and privilege can be just as limiting as assumptions about capability and class. I spent so much time focusing on who deserved opportunities that I wasn't thinking clearly about how to create more opportunities. Marcus appreciated Sarah's reflection, partly because it validated his own evolving understanding of these issues. I think we all learned things about assumptions that year. There's something else. I'm applying for a research assistant position with your Pentagon project. I want to work on the policy implementation side of military recruitment reform. The request surprised Marcus, but it also felt right. Sarah's perspective on social justice issues could complement the economic analysis he and Cameron were conducting. I'd welcome your involvement. The research could benefit from your insights on equity and access issues. Over the following months, Marcus's research team expanded to include several former Westfield students who brought different perspectives to military recruitment and economic mobility analysis. Cameron handled corporate partnerships, Sarah focused on equity implications, and Marcus coordinated the overall policy research. Their work began attracting attention beyond defense circles. The Department of Education wanted to apply their methodology to student loan policy. The Department of Labor was interested in their findings about technical training and career outcomes. Several universities were developing programs based on their recommendations for bridging military and civilian career development. A year after his Pentagon presentation, Marcus received an invitation that brought his journey full circle. Westfield Community College wanted him to deliver the commencement address for graduating students. Standing at the podium in the same gymnasium where he had first attended the military recruitment presentation, Marcus looked out at an audience that included many people who had been part of his transformation from anonymous student to policy researcher. Dr. Kim sat in the faculty section, beaming with what appeared to be maternal pride. Professor Chen was there, having apparently reconciled his views on civil-military relations with Marcus's research findings. Even Dr. Hartwell had attended, though she maintained her characteristic academic reserve. 2 years ago, I sat in these same bleachers as a student who thought he understood his own limitations, Marcus began. I had convinced myself that my circumstances defined my possibilities, and that proving my independence required rejecting opportunities that might have been available to me. He saw Cameron in the audience, sitting with his parents, all of whom were listening with obvious interest. Sarah was there too, along with several other former classmates who had become part of his extended research network. I learned something important during my time here. Authenticity doesn't require limiting yourself to the lowest common denominator of opportunity. It requires using whatever advantages you have, whether they're earned, inherited, or accidentally acquired, for purposes larger than personal advancement. Marcus paused, looking specifically at the graduating students in the front rows. Many of them faced the same economic constraints he had experienced, the same assumptions about their capabilities and limitations. For those of you graduating today who feel like your backgrounds limit your options, I want you to know that capabilities and circumstances are different things. Your current situation influences your perspective, but it doesn't determine your potential. He continued, sharing specific examples of how his research had created programs designed to expand opportunities for students regardless of their economic backgrounds. The military partnership programs, the technical training initiatives, the university collaborations, all had emerged from insights gained during his year of voluntary constraint. The goal isn't to escape your background or to apologize for your advantages. The goal is to use whatever perspective you've gained to contribute to solutions that serve people facing the challenges you understand. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by dozens of students and community members who wanted to discuss his research, his career path, and his insights about education and opportunity. Many of the conversations reminded him of his own uncertainty 2 years earlier about how to navigate between different worlds and different expectations. Professor Chen approached him as the crowd began to thin. Marcus, I owe you an acknowledgement. Your research has changed how I think about the relationship between military service and economic opportunity. I may have been too quick to dismiss military careers as exploitation rather than genuine opportunity. I think military service can be both, depending on how it's structured and what alternatives people have available, Marcus replied diplomatically. Exactly. Your research shows how policy design can determine whether military service functions as exploitation or opportunity. As Marcus drove back to Washington that evening, he reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him from community college anonymity to Pentagon policy influence. His year of hiding his background had taught him things about economic constraint and social assumption that no amount of privileged education could have provided. But accepting his family connections had given him platforms to act on those insights at scales that individual achievement alone couldn't have reached. His phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Hendricks. Saw the news coverage of your commencement speech. Your father would have been proud of the work you're doing. Marcus smiled as he typed his response. I hope so, but I think he would have been more proud that I found a way to serve that feels authentic to who I am. The response came quickly. That's exactly what military service should be about. Finding ways to serve that utilize your capabilities while serving purposes larger than yourself. As Marcus pulled into his apartment complex, he realized that his story had never really been about choosing between privilege and authenticity, or between family connections and individual achievement. It had been about finding ways to integrate all aspects of his identity and experience into work that mattered for people facing the kinds of choices he had navigated. His research continued to influence military recruitment policy, his team was expanding to address broader questions about economic mobility and public service, and his doctoral dissertation was being published by Georgetown University Press, with interest from policymakers across multiple government agencies. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that true success wasn't measured by rejecting advantages or accepting them, but by using whatever combination of capabilities, connections, and circumstances he possessed to create opportunities for others to navigate their own complex choices about service, education, and authentic contribution to something larger than themselves. The young man who had once hidden his identity to prove his independence had become someone who could openly acknowledge his advantages while using them to expand possibilities for people who shared his commitment to service but not his family connections. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of person he had hoped to become when he first walked into that community college classroom, just arrived at through a more complex and ultimately more meaningful path than he had originally imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.